You can cry somewhere else. This house belongs to us now." Those were the first words my daughter-in-law spoke to me after my husband's funeral, and even now, I can still hear them as clearly as if she were standing beside me. The last guest had just left. The flowers were beginning to wilt in their arrangements. Half-empty casserole dishes sat on my kitchen counters. The house felt strangely quiet after a day filled with condolences, handshakes, and whispered expressions of sympathy. For 51 years, this had been the home my husband Richard and I built together. Every room carried a memory. Every wall held a piece of our life. Yet there I stood in the entryway, still wearing the black dress I had worn to bury my husband, while my daughter-in-law Vanessa looked at me as though I were an inconvenience. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. Grief does strange things to the mind. It slows everything down. Sounds seem distant. Faces blur together. I blinked and looked at her. Vanessa crossed her arms and glanced around the living room. "Michael and I need some time to discuss renovations," she said. "The sooner we start making plans, the better." I stared at her. Behind her, family photographs lined the mantel. In one picture, Richard stood beside me during our 40th anniversary celebration, smiling beneath a string of backyard lights. In another, he held our grandson as a newborn. My chest tightened. The funeral had ended less than an hour earlier. Less than an hour. I still had my husband's folded handkerchief in my purse. His scent still lingered faintly on the coat hanging in our bedroom closet. Yet somehow Vanessa was already talking about renovations. I looked toward my son Michael, hoping he would say something. Hoping he would laugh awkwardly and explain that this was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he avoided my eyes. He stood near the dining room doorway staring at the hardwood floor. The silence felt heavier than Vanessa's words. "I think I need to sit down," I said quietly. Vanessa shrugged. "Do whatever you need to do." Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. I remained where I was for several seconds. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. 51 years of marriage had ended 3 days earlier when Richard passed away peacefully in hospice care. Since then, I had been moving through life 1 hour at a time, signing paperwork, choosing flowers, greeting relatives, accepting sympathy cards. I had not even begun processing the reality of losing him. Now, suddenly, I found myself confronting something else entirely. I walked slowly into the living room and lowered myself into Richard's favorite chair. The fabric still carried a slight indentation from years of use. He used to sit there every evening reading history books while I worked on crossword puzzles beside him. Sometimes we would sit for an hour without speaking. We never needed to fill every silence. Comfortable silence is one of the rewards of a long marriage. I glanced around the room. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. The maple tree Richard planted 25 years earlier swayed gently in the breeze. He had planted it when our grandson was born. "They'll grow together," he told me at the time. Somehow, both had grown faster than I expected. Footsteps approached from the kitchen. I looked up, expecting Vanessa. Instead, it was my grandson Noah. At 21 years old, he was still young enough to wear every emotion openly across his face. He sat beside me and handed me a glass of water. "Are you okay, Grandma?" he asked softly. The question nearly broke my heart because it was the first genuine concern anyone had shown me all afternoon. I forced a small smile. "I will be." Noah nodded. He looked uncomfortable, as though he sensed tension without fully understanding it. "Grandpa loved this house," he said. I glanced around the room. Yes, he did. For a few moments, we sat quietly together. Then voices drifted in from the kitchen. Vanessa's voice carried easily through the hallway. "The master bedroom should become ours. It makes the most sense." Another voice answered. "Michael." I could not hear his words clearly. Vanessa continued. "And we can open up the wall between the kitchen and dining room. The layout feels outdated." My fingers tightened around the glass. Noah heard it too. His expression changed. "What are they talking about?" he asked. I looked down at the water in my hands. Tiny ripples moved across the surface. "I do not know," I answered honestly. But deep down, I was beginning to suspect exactly what they were talking about. For years, Vanessa had shown unusual interest in this house. She often asked questions about property values. She watched home renovation shows obsessively. She once spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner discussing how she would redesign the kitchen if she ever owned an older home. At the time, I dismissed it as harmless conversation. Sitting there now, those memories felt different. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a picture I did not want to see. As evening approached, relatives continued calling to check on me. Friends stopped by with meals. Neighbors offered help. Through it all, Vanessa moved around the house with surprising confidence. She opened cabinets, examined rooms, measured spaces with her eyes. Once, I caught her studying the staircase as if mentally planning changes. Every observation settled deeper into my thoughts. That night, after everyone finally left, I climbed the stairs alone. The bedroom felt impossibly large without Richard. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand. A novel lay open beside the lamp where he had left it weeks earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the room we had shared for more than 5 decades. Then I remembered something. About 6 months before his death, Richard had spent several afternoons organizing documents in his home office. When I asked what he was doing, he simply smiled and said, "Putting things in order." At the time, I assumed he meant ordinary paperwork. Now, lying awake in the darkness, I found myself wondering what exactly he had put in order. Downstairs, the house creaked softly as it always had. Outside, wind brushed against the windows. I closed my eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of the home Richard and I built together. Vanessa believed she knew the future of this house. She spoke with the confidence of someone already celebrating a victory. What she did not know was that Richard had never been careless. Not with his family, not with his responsibilities, and certainly not with the home we spent our lives creating together. As sleep finally began to pull me under, one thought stayed with me. If Richard truly had put things in order before he died, then somewhere inside this house was a truth that neither Vanessa nor I had fully discovered yet. The next morning I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then my eyes drifted toward the empty side of the bed, and reality settled over me once again. 51 years of marriage had trained me to expect Richard's presence. The quiet felt unnatural. I lay there listening to the house. Every sound seemed louder than before. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant chirping of birds outside, the faint creak of old floorboards. Eventually, I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. Richard used to make coffee every morning before I woke up. He always claimed I needed caffeine before conversation. The memory brought the smallest smile to my face. I reached for the coffee pot and froze. Vanessa was already in the kitchen. She stood at the counter reviewing something on her tablet. Several pages of printed floor plans lay beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she glanced up and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind people use when they are trying to appear polite. "Good morning," she said. I looked at the papers. "What are those?" Vanessa casually turned one of the pages. "Just ideas." I walked closer. The drawings showed kitchen layouts, cabinet designs, wall removals, renovation concepts. My stomach tightened. Richard had been gone for 4 days. For days. "You seem very busy," I said quietly. Vanessa shrugged. "Life moves forward." The words landed harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as she intended. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat near the window. Outside, sunlight was beginning to touch the backyard. The maple tree Richard planted stood proudly in the morning light. I remembered helping him dig the hole for it. We spent nearly 3 hours arguing about the best location before finally agreeing. Looking at that tree now felt like looking at a living memory. Vanessa continued reviewing her papers. Every few minutes she made notes, measurements, costs, timelines. Eventually she stood and gathered everything together. "Michael and I are meeting a contractor next week," she said. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. "A contractor?" "Just to explore options." She spoke as though discussing the weather. "No decisions have been made." I stared at her. "You are discussing renovations before Richard has even been buried for a full week." Vanessa's expression hardened slightly. "With all due respect, Eleanor, delaying practical decisions does not change reality." There was that word again. Reality. Everyone seemed eager to define reality for me these days. I watched her leave the kitchen carrying the plans beneath her arm. Once she was gone, I sat motionless for several minutes. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed physically, because I was beginning to see things differently. Throughout the day, old memories kept returning. Small moments I had ignored for years. Questions Vanessa asked about property taxes. Conversations about home values. Comments about retirement assets. At the time, each remark seemed harmless. Looking back, they formed a pattern. That afternoon, Noah stopped by unexpectedly. He carried a grocery bag filled with sandwiches and drinks. Mom said you probably have enough leftovers to feed an army, he joked. So, I figured I would bring something different. I laughed for the first time in days. We sat together on the back patio. The weather was mild. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. College classes, friends, sports. Then Noah became serious. Grandma, can I ask you something? I nodded. Of course. He looked toward the house. Have Mom and Dad always talked about moving in here? The question caught me off guard. Why do you ask? Noah shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Because I overheard something last month. My attention sharpened immediately. What did you hear? Noah hesitated. Mom was talking to one of her friends. He looked embarrassed. She said that once Grandpa's situation became final, everything would be different. A chill moved through me despite the warm afternoon. Did she say anything else? Noah nodded slowly. She said it would finally be her chance to make the house look the way it should. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I stared across the backyard toward Richard's workshop. The small building stood exactly where he left it. His gardening tools were still hanging neatly on the wall inside. His workbench remained covered with unfinished projects. Everything about that workshop reflected the man who built it. Careful, patient, thoughtful. The idea of someone casually redesigning his life's work felt deeply unsettling. Noah studied my face. I am sorry, he said quietly. I should have told you sooner. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You have nothing to apologize for. Later that evening, after Noah left, I found myself standing outside Richard's old home office. The door remained closed. Since his death, I had only entered the room briefly. Every object inside carried emotional weight. His desk, his books, his favorite reading lamp. I rested my hand on the doorknob and remembered what he said months earlier. Putting things in order. The phrase echoed in my mind. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped inside. Dust floated through the fading sunlight. The room smelled faintly of old books and cedar wood. Everything appeared exactly as he left it. Yet something drew my attention almost immediately. On the far side of the room stood a large filing cabinet. One drawer was slightly open, just barely, as though someone had closed it in a hurry. I walked across the room and pulled it open. Inside were neatly organized folders. Insurance documents, tax records, investment statements. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then I noticed a manila envelope resting at the very back. Unlike everything else, it had no label, no date, no markings, just a sealed envelope tucked carefully behind the files. My heartbeat quickened. I stared at it for a long moment without touching it. Outside the office window, evening shadows stretched across the lawn. The house remained quiet. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa laughing at something on television. The sound felt strangely distant. Slowly, I reached for the envelope. Whatever Richard had been putting in order before he died, I suddenly had a feeling this envelope might be connected to it. And for the first time since the funeral, I sensed that the future everyone seemed so confident about might not be as certain as they believed. For several seconds, I simply stood there holding the envelope. The room felt unusually still. Even the sounds from downstairs seemed to fade into the background. My fingers traced the sealed edge, while a dozen possibilities raced through my mind. Perhaps it contained insurance information. Perhaps it was another set of financial records. Perhaps it was nothing important at all. Yet deep down, I knew Richard well enough to recognize intention when I saw it. He had hidden this envelope carefully. Not carelessly. Not accidentally. Carefully. I carried it to his desk and sat in the chair where he had spent countless evenings paying bills, balancing accounts, and planning for the future. The leather creaked softly beneath me. For a moment, I could almost picture him sitting across from me with his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside were several documents and a handwritten letter. My heart immediately tightened at the sight of Richard's handwriting. I set the papers aside and unfolded the letter first. My Eleanor, it began. Tears instantly filled my eyes. Richard rarely wrote letters. After 51 years of marriage, most things no longer needed writing. Yet there his words were, preserved on paper. I took a slow breath and continued reading. The letter was dated 3 months before his death. He wrote about many things. Our marriage, the family we built, the life we shared. He thanked me for standing beside him through difficult years and joyful ones. Several times I had to stop reading because my vision blurred. Then the tone of the letter shifted. Richard explained that he had spent months organizing our affairs. He wanted everything simplified, protected, secure. One sentence immediately caught my attention. I suspect certain assumptions may be made after I am gone. I read the line twice. Then a third time. Richard continued. He never mentioned Vanessa by name, but I knew exactly who he was talking about. He explained that he had taken steps to ensure my future remained entirely under my control. Beneath the letter sat several legal documents. I began reviewing them carefully. Some were familiar, others were not. One document in particular carried the heading of a trust agreement. My pulse quickened. Richard and I had discussed trust years ago, but never in great detail. At least, that was what I believed. The more I read, the more I realized how much planning he had done privately during his final months. Every page seemed to reveal another layer of preparation. By the time I reached the final document, I understood one thing clearly. Richard had not left our future to chance. Not even close. I spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the contents before finally placing everything back inside the envelope. Outside, darkness had settled across the neighborhood. Downstairs, I could hear the television playing faintly. Vanessa and Michael were still in the living room. The contrast between their confidence and the documents now sitting on Richard's desk almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I carefully returned everything to the envelope and locked it inside the desk drawer. I was not ready to confront anyone. Not yet. Facts are powerful, but timing matters. The next morning, I noticed another change in the household. Vanessa had become even more comfortable discussing future plans openly. During breakfast, she mentioned paint colors, new flooring, furniture arrangements. Every conversation seemed to assume the same outcome. She spoke as though ownership had already transferred. Michael rarely contributed much. Mostly he nodded and listened. His silence bothered me nearly as much as Vanessa's confidence. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles. Neighbors watered lawns. Dogs barked from behind fences. Ordinary life continued regardless of personal grief. As I walked, memories surfaced one after another. Richard teaching Michael to ride a bicycle on these very streets. Family barbecues. Holiday decorations. Birthday parties. Nearly every important chapter of our family story was connected to that house in some way. The idea that someone viewed it primarily as a renovation project felt increasingly painful. Halfway through my walk, I received a phone call. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Thomas Whitaker, Richard's attorney. I stopped walking immediately. Thomas, I answered. Eleanor, I have been meaning to call you, he said warmly. First, let me say again how sorry I am about Richard. We spoke briefly about the funeral. Then Thomas cleared his throat. There are a few matters Richard instructed me to discuss with you when you felt ready. My attention sharpened. What kind of matters? A brief silence followed. The kind Richard spent considerable time preparing. I glanced down the quiet street. Suddenly, the envelope in Richard's desk seemed even more significant. Thomas suggested meeting later that week. There is no emergency, he assured me. But Richard was very specific about certain instructions. After we ended the call, I remained standing on the sidewalk for several moments. The morning breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Richard was gone. That reality would never change. Yet more and more, I found evidence that he had been thinking ahead long before any of us realized. When I returned home, I found Vanessa measuring the living room. A tape measure stretched across the hardwood floor. She looked up and smiled. Just getting a sense of the space, she said. I smiled politely in return. For the first time since the funeral, her confidence no longer unsettled me. If anything, it made me curious. Curious about what expression might appear on her face once she learned what Richard had actually put in order. Upstairs, locked safely inside a desk drawer, the envelope waited. And in 3 days, I would be sitting across from the one person who knew exactly why Richard had created it in the first place. 3 days later, I drove across town to meet Thomas Whitaker. The law office occupied the second floor of a red brick building. Richard and I had visited many times over the years. Walking through those familiar doors without my husband beside me felt strange. For decades, we handled every major decision together. Now I was learning how to carry those responsibilities alone. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room overlooking a small park. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating shelves filled with legal books. A few minutes later, Thomas entered carrying a thick folder. He shook my hand gently and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled sadly. "Richard talked about you constantly," he said. I felt my throat tighten. "I talked about him too." Thomas nodded. "I imagine you did." He opened the folder and removed several documents. "Before we discuss anything else, I want you to know that Richard was exceptionally thorough." That statement did not surprise me. Richard approached everything carefully. Whether he was repairing a fence, planning a family vacation, or organizing finances, he believed preparation solved most problems before they began. Thomas slid a document toward me. "About 8 months ago, Richard requested a complete review of all family assets." I looked down at the paperwork. Familiar account names appeared throughout the pages. Investments, property records, trust documents. Everything seemed meticulously organized. "He was worried about his health," Thomas continued. "Not frightened, just realistic." I nodded slowly. Richard had always been practical. Even during his illness, he spent more time worrying about everyone else than himself. Thomas turned several pages and stopped at a section marked with colored tabs. "This is the part he considered most important." My attention sharpened immediately. "Why?" Thomas folded his hands together. "Because he wanted to ensure that no one could pressure you into decisions you did not want to make." The room fell silent. For the first time, I felt certain Richard had anticipated something. Maybe not specific events, but something. Thomas continued explaining the structure Richard had created. The family home, retirement accounts, investment funds. Everything had been reviewed and reorganized. Every document seemed designed around one principle. My security came first. Not convenience, not assumptions. Security. As the meeting continued, one detail became increasingly clear. Richard had not merely prepared paperwork. He had built layers of protection. Legal protections, financial protections, decision-making protections. The kind of protections created by someone who understands how quickly circumstances can change after a death. Thomas eventually paused and looked directly at me. Richard left very specific instructions regarding the house. There it was, the subject that had hovered over every conversation since the funeral. I sat quietly and listened. By the time he finished explaining, I felt something I had not experienced in weeks. Relief. Genuine relief. Not because grief had disappeared. Nothing could change the fact that Richard was gone. But for the first time, I no longer felt uncertain about the future. Richard had taken care of that uncertainty himself. Thomas handed me copies of several documents. "Take your time reviewing everything," he said. "There is no rush." I smiled faintly. "You sound exactly like Richard." Thomas laughed. "That is probably because he told me the same thing every time we met." After leaving the office, I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me. Traffic moved steadily through the afternoon sunlight. People hurried between appointments. Life continued as usual, yet my entire perspective had shifted. Vanessa believed she understood the future. Michael probably believed it too. Neither of them had any idea how carefully Richard had planned. When I arrived home, I immediately noticed a truck parked in the driveway. My stomach tightened. The logo on the side identified a local home improvement company. I parked and walked toward the front door. Inside, voices echoed through the living room. Vanessa stood beside a man holding a clipboard. They were discussing measurements, costs, remodeling options. The contractor glanced up politely when I entered. Vanessa smiled as though nothing about the situation was unusual. "We are just gathering estimates," she said. I looked around the room. The contractor had notes spread across the coffee table. Measurements covered several sheets of paper. It was obvious this conversation had gone far beyond casual curiosity. For a brief moment, anger flickered inside me. Then it disappeared. Anger would accomplish nothing. Facts would accomplish everything. "I see," I said calmly. Vanessa seemed surprised by my reaction. Perhaps she expected an argument, a confrontation. Instead, I walked upstairs carrying the folder from Thomas. The office door closed softly behind me. I placed the documents inside Richard's desk and sat quietly for a few minutes. Through the window, I could see the contractor eventually leaving. Vanessa remained outside talking on her phone. Her gestures appeared excited, optimistic, certain. I found myself remembering a conversation Richard and I shared years earlier. We were painting the back fence one summer afternoon when he suddenly looked at me and said, "Confidence is wonderful when it is supported by facts." I laughed and asked what happened when it was not. His answer was simple. Then it becomes a surprise waiting to happen. Sitting alone in the office, I smiled for the first time in days. Downstairs, plans continued. Assumptions continued. Expectations continued. None of them changed reality. That evening, Noah stopped by after work. We sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Eventually, he noticed the difference in my mood. "You seem calmer," he said. I looked toward the maple tree swaying gently in the evening breeze. "I think your grandfather left me exactly what I needed." Noah smiled. "Advice?" I thought about the letter, the documents, the protections, the planning. "Something even better," I replied. "Peace of mind." As darkness settled across the neighborhood, porch lights flickered on one by one. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, because I finally understood something important. Richard had known he could not stay forever, but he had also known that love does not end with absence. Sometimes love looks like preparation. Sometimes it looks like protection. And sometimes it waits quietly inside a folder until the exact moment it is needed. Over the next week, I said very little about the documents Thomas had shown me. That surprised even me. Years earlier, I might have confronted the situation immediately. I might have demanded explanations and challenged assumptions the moment they appeared. But grief changes a person. Losing Richard had taught me the value of patience. Some truths become more powerful when people walk directly into them on their own. Meanwhile, Vanessa seemed more certain than ever that the future belonged to her. Every day brought another conversation about changes she wanted to make. New paint colors, updated fixtures, expanded rooms. She spoke about the house the way someone discusses a property they have already purchased. One afternoon, I came downstairs to find samples spread across the dining room table. Small squares of hardwood flooring, fabric swatches, kitchen countertop materials. Vanessa looked up and smiled. I wanted to compare options while everything is fresh. I glanced at the display. Options for what? She laughed lightly as though the answer were obvious. For later. That single word carried an entire assumption inside it. Later. The future she imagined seemed so certain in her mind that she no longer bothered hiding it. I simply nodded and continued making tea. Across the room, Michael sat quietly reading something on his phone. He rarely participated in these discussions, yet he never stopped them either. That silence continued bothering me. One evening, while Vanessa attended dinner with friends, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the backyard. The sun was setting behind the maple tree Richard planted years ago. We sat in lawn chairs facing the garden. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Michael surprised me. "Dad always trusted you with everything," he said. I turned toward him. "Why are you thinking about that?" He shrugged. "I do not know. Maybe because I keep remembering little things." His eyes followed a bird crossing the evening sky. "When I was younger, I used to think Dad handled every important decision." He smiled faintly. "As I got older, I realized he always talked to you first." I listened quietly. "He respected your judgment," Michael continued, "more than anyone else's." The statement lingered in the air. "Your father and I were partners," I said softly. Michael nodded. "That is what I mean." For a moment, he seemed on the verge of saying something else. Then he stopped. The opportunity passed. Yet I sensed uncertainty growing inside him. Small cracks were beginning to form beneath the confidence Vanessa had built around their future plans. The following morning brought another unexpected development. Noah arrived carrying a cardboard box. "I found these in Grandpa's workshop," he explained. We carried the box into the kitchen and opened it together. Inside were old photographs, notebooks, and several journals Richard had kept over the years. Most contained ordinary entries. Home projects, gardening notes, vacation plans, family milestones. Yet reading them felt like hearing his voice again. Noah and I spent hours sorting through the contents. Occasionally we laughed at old memories. Occasionally we sat quietly when a particular photograph caught us by surprise. Near the bottom of the box, I found a notebook from nearly 15 years earlier. Inside, Richard had written reflections about family. Nothing dramatic, just observations, hopes, concerns. One entry immediately captured my attention. He wrote about the importance of preserving independence as people age. He believed older adults should never feel pressured into surrendering decisions simply because others believed they knew better. The words felt remarkably relevant. Grandpa thought about everything, Noah said after reading part of the entry. I smiled. Yes, he did. Later that day, another contractor visited the house. Then another. By the end of the week, at least 4 different professionals had walked through various rooms discussing possibilities. Every time I encountered them, Vanessa offered the same explanation. Just gathering information. Yet the conversation sounded increasingly specific. Budgets, timelines, construction schedules. One evening, while carrying laundry upstairs, I overheard part of a phone conversation. Vanessa stood in the kitchen speaking excitedly with someone. The master suite alone will change everything, she said. Once we start updating the place, the value will jump dramatically. I paused halfway up the staircase. The certainty in her voice was remarkable. Not once did she speak as though the future remained uncertain. Not once did she acknowledge the possibility that things might not unfold according to her plans. I quietly continued upstairs without making my presence known. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in Richard's office reviewing the documents again. The more I read, the more impressed I became. Every detail had been considered, every possibility examined. Richard had anticipated confusion. He had anticipated assumptions. Most importantly, he had anticipated pressure. The protections Thomas described were not accidental. They were intentional responses to concerns Richard clearly recognized long before anyone else. As I turned another page, a folded note slipped from the folder. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richard. The note contained only a few sentences. Yet they stopped me completely. If you are reading this, then you are probably facing more opinions than advice. Trust yourself. Nobody knows what is best for you better than you do. I stared at the words for a long time. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The house remained quiet. Downstairs, everyone slept peacefully. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. Confidence. Not arrogance. Not revenge. Confidence. The kind that comes from understanding the truth. Vanessa believed she was moving steadily toward a future she had already imagined. What she did not realize was that every new plan, every assumption, and every contractor visit was bringing her closer to a reality she had never expected. And somewhere ahead, that reality was waiting patiently for the perfect moment to reveal itself. 2 weeks after my meeting with Thomas, the atmosphere inside the house began to change in subtle ways. Vanessa no longer spoke about renovations as distant possibilities. She spoke about them as scheduled events. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found a large binder spread across the table. Tabs divided sections labeled kitchen remodel, primary suite, landscaping, and future budget. Vanessa was reviewing contractor estimates while talking on the phone. She barely looked up when I entered. The timeline should work perfectly, she said into the receiver. We can probably start by early fall. The confidence in her voice would have been impressive if it had not been built entirely on assumptions. I quietly prepared a cup of tea and sat near the window. Outside, the backyard looked exactly as Richard left it. The flower beds remained neatly arranged. The bird feeder still attracted cardinals every morning. The garden path we built together 20 years earlier curved gently toward his workshop. Looking at it brought back a memory. Richard kneeling in the dirt with a measuring tape while insisting that every stone had to be perfectly aligned. I smiled despite myself. Across the room, Vanessa continued planning a future she believed was already guaranteed. Later that evening, Michael returned from work carrying several folders. I noticed him and Vanessa disappear into the dining room. Their voices drifted into the hallway. Normally, I would have ignored the conversation. That night, however, certain words caught my attention. Mortgage, equity, appraisal, financing. I remained seated in the living room, pretending to read. A few minutes later, Noah arrived unexpectedly. He found me on the couch and immediately sensed something unusual. Everything okay? He asked quietly. I glanced toward the dining room. That depends on your definition of okay. Noah followed my gaze. Through the doorway, we could see Michael and Vanessa studying paperwork. Still talking about the house? He asked. I nodded. Noah shook his head slowly. I do not understand how they can focus on that right now. Neither did I. Yet increasingly, I suspected the house had become more than a home in Vanessa's mind. It had become a destination. a reward she believed was waiting for her. The following weekend provided another surprise. I returned from grocery shopping and found two unfamiliar vehicles parked in the driveway. Inside, a pair of interior designers walked through the living room discussing furniture placement. One held a tablet displaying digital renderings. The other carried fabric samples. Vanessa guided them from room to room with the enthusiasm of someone preparing for a magazine feature. When she noticed me standing in the entryway, she smiled brightly. "We are just exploring possibilities." The phrase had become her favorite explanation. I nodded politely and carried my groceries into the kitchen. As I unpacked vegetables and canned goods, I found myself thinking about something Thomas said during our meeting. Richard was exceptionally thorough. The words brought a sense of calm. Every new assumption being made under this roof only strengthened my appreciation for my husband's foresight. Several days later, Thomas called again. His tone sounded professional but warm. "I wanted to let you know everything is finalized," he said. "All documents have been reviewed and recorded." My pulse quickened slightly. Everything. He paused. Richard would be pleased. After we ended the call, I sat quietly at the kitchen table for several minutes. Sunlight streamed across the hardwood floor. The house felt peaceful, secure. For the first time since Richard's death, I realized I was no longer worried about what might happen. The uncertainty had disappeared. What remained was patience. That evening, I noticed another shift in Michael. He seemed distracted, thoughtful. During dinner, Vanessa enthusiastically discussed paint selections while Michael pushed food around his plate. Eventually, she asked for his opinion on cabinet finishes. "Whatever you think is best," he replied. His voice lacked conviction. Vanessa frowned. "You are usually more interested in these conversations." Michael looked down at his plate. Maybe because they are starting to feel premature. The room instantly became quiet. Vanessa stared at him. "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "Dad has not even been gone a month." For the first time, genuine tension appeared between them. Vanessa quickly defended herself. She talked about planning ahead, being practical, preparing for the future. Michael listened but seemed unconvinced. I remained silent throughout the exchange. Sometimes silence reveals more than participation. After dinner, Noah helped me clear the table. As we carried dishes into the kitchen, he lowered his voice. "Dad has been asking questions lately." I looked at him carefully. "Questions about what?" Noah glanced toward the dining room. "Grandpa's paperwork, the house, financial stuff." My attention sharpened immediately. "Has he?" Noah nodded. "I think he is starting to realize there are things he does not know." That observation stayed with me long after everyone went to bed. Later that night, I sat alone in Richard's office once again. The room had become a place of comfort, a place where facts existed without emotion distorting them. I opened the desk drawer and removed the folder Thomas had helped me understand. Every page represented planning, protection, love expressed through preparation. As I reviewed the documents, my eyes settled on Richard's handwritten note. "Trust yourself. Nobody knows what is best for you better than you do." I read the words twice. Then I carefully returned everything to the drawer. Downstairs, the house remained quiet. Yet beneath that quiet, something important was happening. Vanessa continued building expectations. Michael was beginning to question them. Noah was paying attention. And I was no longer the confused widow sitting alone after a funeral. I knew the truth. More importantly, I knew exactly when that truth would need to be revealed. The only thing left was waiting for the moment when assumptions finally collided with reality. The moment arrived sooner than I expected. It began on a quiet Thursday afternoon when Michael knocked on the door of Richard's office. I was sitting at the desk organizing several family photographs when he stepped inside. His expression immediately caught my attention. He looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, mentally exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying questions nobody seems willing to answer. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I closed the photo album and nodded. "Of course." Michael entered the room and shut the door behind him. For several seconds, he simply looked around. His eyes moved across the bookshelves, the desk, the framed photographs, and the workshop plans hanging on the wall. "Dad loved this room," he said quietly. "Yes, he did." Michael smiled faintly. "I used to think it was because he liked working alone." He paused. "Now I think it was because he could think clearly here." I remained silent. Eventually, he sat across from me. "Mom, I need to ask you something directly." The seriousness in his voice told me this conversation mattered. "Go ahead." He took a slow breath. Did Dad leave instructions about the house? There it was. The question that had been slowly making its way toward the surface for weeks. I studied my son's face carefully. Gone was the certainty I had seen immediately after the funeral. Gone was the passive acceptance of Vanessa's plans. What remained was genuine curiosity mixed with concern. Why are you asking now? I replied gently. Michael leaned forward. Because nothing makes sense anymore. He rubbed his forehead. Vanessa keeps talking about moving forward. Contractors keep visiting. Plans keep expanding. But every time I think about Dad, I hear his voice telling me to slow down. He laughed quietly. The man spent 6 months researching lawn tractors before buying one. He would never leave something as important as this house unresolved. I felt a small surge of pride. Richard would have appreciated that observation. Michael was finally paying attention. Your father did leave instructions, I said. Michael stared at me. He did. I nodded. The room grew very still. Outside the office window, sunlight filtered through the maple tree. The same tree Richard planted when Noah was born. Why didn't you tell me? Michael asked. Because I was still learning what those instructions meant. The answer was true. In the weeks since Richard's death, I had needed time. Time to grieve. Time to understand. Time to separate emotion from fact. Michael sat quietly. Then he surprised me. Vanessa already has contractors creating estimates. I smiled faintly. I know. His eyes widened. You know? I have seen them. He looked embarrassed. I should have stopped it sooner. I shook my head. No. You should have asked questions sooner. The distinction seemed to hit him immediately. Michael lowered his eyes. That is fair. We sat quietly for several moments. Then he spoke again. I think I made a mistake. His voice sounded smaller than usual. Older, somehow. I kept assuming things because everyone around me was assuming the same things. I looked at my son and remembered the little boy who used to follow Richard around the backyard asking endless questions. Somewhere along the way, that curiosity had been replaced by convenience. He stopped questioning what seemed obvious. It happens, I said softly. Michael nodded. Dad warned me about that once. I raised an eyebrow. Did he? Michael smiled sadly. He said assumptions are expensive because they make people stop paying attention. The words sounded exactly like Richard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Michael looked directly at me. What happens next? I considered the question carefully. That depends. On what? On whether people want the truth or just the version of it they find comfortable. The office fell silent again. Michael stared out the window for several seconds before nodding slowly. I could see the realization settling over him. He was beginning to understand that the story everyone had been telling themselves since the funeral might not survive contact with reality. Later that evening, another unexpected event occurred. Vanessa hosted a small dinner for several friends. I had planned to spend the evening quietly upstairs, but while walking through the hallway, I overheard part of a conversation. One of her friends asked how renovation plans were progressing. Vanessa laughed confidently. Everything is moving exactly the way we expected. I stopped briefly near the staircase. By next year, the place will look completely different, she continued. Her friends sounded impressed. They asked questions about room expansions and design concepts. Vanessa answered each one with remarkable certainty. Listening to her, I realized something important. She no longer saw possibility. She saw ownership. In her mind, the outcome had already been decided. I quietly continued upstairs. Anger never arrived. Neither did resentment. Instead, I felt an odd sense of calm. The farther assumptions traveled from reality, the more dramatic the eventual correction would become. The next morning, Thomas called. His timing could not have been more perfect. Everything is ready, he said. The final documents have been assembled exactly as Richard requested. My heart beat slightly faster. What happens now? Thomas paused. Now comes the easy part. I laughed softly. You and I have very different definitions of easy. He chuckled. Perhaps. But facts are easier than uncertainty. After the call ended, I stood at the kitchen window watching morning sunlight spread across the backyard. For weeks, I had been reacting to events. Listening, observing, learning. Now, for the first time, I felt the story beginning to shift. Not because I intended to fight anyone. Not because I wanted revenge. Because reality was finally ready to speak for itself. Upstairs, inside Richard's office, the documents sat exactly where he left them. Downstairs, Vanessa continued planning a future she believed was already hers. Somewhere between those two worlds, A collision was approaching. And for the first time since the funeral, I knew exactly when it would happen. The dinner took place the following Saturday evening. Vanessa insisted on hosting it herself. She spent 2 days preparing the menu and decorating the dining room. Fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. Candles flickered softly beside polished silverware. To anyone looking from the outside, it appeared to be a warm family gathering. Yet beneath the surface, something else waited. I could feel it. Perhaps Michael could too. He had been unusually quiet all week. Noah arrived first and greeted everyone with a smile. A few minutes later, I took my seat while Vanessa moved confidently around the room, making final adjustments. She seemed happier than she had been in months. Looking back, I understand why. She believed she was celebrating a future she had already secured. Dinner began pleasantly enough. We talked about work, school, and neighborhood events. Vanessa described several renovation ideas she had recently finalized. Noah listened politely. Michael barely contributed. I remained quiet, observing. Several times, I noticed Michael staring at the family photographs displayed along the dining room wall. One picture showed Richard standing proudly beside the house shortly after we purchased it decades earlier. Another showed him teaching Noah how to fish. Every photograph seemed to remind him of something important. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa raised her glass. I know this year has been difficult, she began, but I think it is important to look forward. The room grew quieter. Life changes, she continued, and sometimes those changes create opportunities for new beginnings. Noah lowered his eyes. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Vanessa smiled and looked around the table. I think Richard would want us to keep moving forward. There it was. The moment I had been expecting. Not because of what she said, because of what she believed those words represented. Vanessa continued discussing future plans. Room designs, landscaping projects, furniture replacements. Every sentence carried the same assumption beneath it. The house belonged to the future she imagined. Finally, she looked toward me. I hope you know we want what is best for everyone. I met her gaze calmly. I believe you think that. The wording seemed to confuse her. Before she could respond, I reached beside my chair and picked up a leather folder. The same folder Thomas helped prepare. The same folder Richard spent months planning. The room immediately became still. Michael noticed it first. His expression changed. Noah looked from me to the folder and back again. Vanessa appeared curious rather than concerned. What is that? She asked. I placed the folder gently on the table. Something Richard wanted the family to understand. Nobody spoke. Slowly, I opened the folder and removed several documents. The soft rustle of paper sounded unusually loud in the silence. Michael stared at the pages. Noah leaned forward slightly. Vanessa remained confident, at least for the moment. Before Richard passed away, he spent considerable time organizing our affairs. Vanessa nodded as though she already knew where the conversation was heading. She did not. He met with attorneys, financial advisors, estate planners. I paused briefly. He was very thorough. Michael's eyes never left the documents. Vanessa folded her hands together. That sounds like Dad. I smiled faintly. It does. Then I slid the first document across the table. Michael picked it up and began reading. Within seconds, his expression changed. He looked at me, then back at the page, then at me again. Mom. His voice trailed off. Vanessa frowned. What is it? Michael did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed her the document. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared on her face. She read silently. Then she read it again. The confidence that had carried her through weeks of planning began to disappear. I do not understand, she said quietly. I reached for another document. Richard created a trust structure designed specifically to protect the house and all decisions regarding it. Vanessa looked up sharply. Protect it from what? I answered honestly. From assumptions. The room became completely silent. Even the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual. Tick, tick, tick. Michael continued reading through additional pages. Every document confirmed the same reality. Richard had anticipated confusion. He had anticipated pressure. Most importantly, he had anticipated people making plans based on expectations rather than facts. Noah finally spoke. Grandpa planned all of this. Yes, I replied. Months before he passed away. Vanessa looked stunned. The certainty that had defined her for weeks was gone. In its place stood genuine disbelief. But the house. She began. Her voice faded. She looked back down at the paperwork. Michael closed the folder slowly. The house was never ours to plan for. The sentence landed heavily. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. Vanessa stared at the documents for a long moment. Then she looked toward me. For the first time since Richard's funeral, her expression contained something I had not seen before. Not confidence. Not entitlement. Humility. "You knew all this time?" she asked quietly. I nodded. I learned shortly after the funeral. Nobody spoke. The room felt different now. Lighter somehow. Not because anyone had won. Because uncertainty had finally been replaced by truth. Michael leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. It looked as though a weight had been lifted from him. Noah smiled faintly. Vanessa lowered her eyes. The plans. The contractors. The designs. The assumptions. All of it had collided with reality in a single evening. Yet the most surprising part was how calm I felt. Weeks earlier, I might have viewed this moment as a confrontation. Now it felt more like clarification. Richard had not left behind confusion. He had left behind certainty. People simply had not known where to find it. As the candles flickered softly across the table, I looked around the room and realized something important. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was accusing anyone of anything. The truth had accomplished something anger never could. It had ended the illusion. And once an illusion disappears, people finally have an opportunity to see one another clearly. The weeks following that dinner were quieter than anyone expected. There was no dramatic argument. No slammed doors. No emotional speeches. In many ways, that made the truth even more powerful. Once the documents had been placed on the table, there was nothing left to debate. Facts do not require volume. They simply require acknowledgement. For several days, Vanessa moved through the house differently. The confidence that once accompanied every conversation about renovations had disappeared. The contractor estimates vanished from the kitchen counter. The design binders were quietly packed away. Conversations about future plans became noticeably less frequent. One afternoon, I found her standing alone in the backyard near the maple tree Richard planted years earlier. She looked thoughtful, smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally. I walked outside and joined her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. "I owe you an apology." The words came quietly, without excuses, without qualifications. I looked at her carefully. She continued staring at the tree. "When Richard died, I thought I was being practical." She paused. "But the truth is, I stopped seeing this house as your home." Her voice trembled slightly. "I started seeing it as my opportunity." The honesty caught me off guard. Not because I disagreed. Because very few people willingly admit uncomfortable truths about themselves. We stood in silence for several seconds. Finally, I nodded. "Thank you for saying that." Vanessa wiped at her eyes. "I cannot change what I said after the funeral." No, she could not. Some words remain with us forever. Yet something important had changed. For the first time since Richard's death, she was speaking from self-awareness instead of entitlement. That mattered. Over the next month, Michael began visiting more often. Sometimes he stopped by after work just to sit on the porch and talk. Other times he helped with small projects around the house. One Saturday morning, we repaired part of the fence together. As we worked, he suddenly laughed. "Dad would tell us we are doing this wrong." I smiled. "Your father thought everyone was doing everything wrong." Michael laughed harder. "That is true." Then his expression softened. "I miss him." The admission hung in the air between us. "I do too," I replied. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Michael looked toward the house. I think I got so distracted by the future that I forgot to appreciate what was already here. The statement sounded painfully familiar. Richard used to say something similar whenever people rushed through important moments. Looking back, I realized this entire experience had forced each of us to confront the same lesson in different ways. Noah perhaps changed the most. Throughout everything, he remained observant, thoughtful, curious. A few weeks before leaving for college, he invited me to lunch. We sat together at a small diner Richard loved. Halfway through the meal, Noah reached into his backpack and handed me a framed photograph. It showed Richard standing beside the maple tree shortly after planting it. The smile on his face looked exactly as I remembered. "I found this in Grandpa's workshop," Noah said. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger. "He would have loved this." Noah smiled. "I know." Then he became serious. "Grandma, can I tell you something?" "Of course." He leaned forward slightly. "Watching all of this taught me something important." I waited. People reveal who they are when they think nobody can stop them. The observation sounded far older than his years. I smiled. Your grandfather would agree with that. Noah nodded. I think he planned everything because he understood people better than they understood themselves. Looking back, I believe he was right. Richard had never been suspicious. He had simply been realistic. He understood that grief creates confusion. Confusion creates assumptions. And assumptions can change relationships in ways people never anticipate. By the time autumn arrived, the atmosphere within the family felt noticeably healthier. Not perfect. Families are rarely perfect. But healthier. Conversations became more honest. Expectations became clearer. Most importantly, respect returned. One evening, nearly 6 months after the funeral, the entire family gathered for dinner again. This time, the mood felt completely different. Nobody discussed renovations. Nobody discussed ownership. Nobody discussed future plans for the house. Instead, we talked about memories. Richard's terrible jokes. His gardening habits. His obsession with researching every purchase. Laughter filled the dining room. Genuine laughter. At one point, Noah raised his glass. To Grandpa. Everyone echoed the sentiment. Then he looked directly at me. And to Grandma. I raised an eyebrow. For what? Noah smiled. For reminding all of us what this house actually means. The room grew quiet. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Michael nodded. Vanessa lowered her eyes. I looked around the table and realized something unexpected. The house had never really been the story. Not entirely. The house was simply the stage where something much deeper played out. Respect. Gratitude. Family. Loss. Entitlement. Love. Every important lesson had existed long before the property itself became an issue. Later that night, after everyone left, I walked through the quiet rooms alone. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. The photographs still lined the mantel. Richard's favorite chair remained exactly where it had always been. Outside, moonlight illuminated the maple tree in the backyard. I stood by the window and smiled softly. Months earlier, I thought losing Richard would leave me completely alone. Instead, his final act of preparation had accomplished something remarkable. He protected more than a house. He protected the truth. And in doing so, he gave every member of this family an opportunity to become a better version of themselves. I never had to argue. I never had to fight. I never had to prove anything. Richard had already done that. All I had to do was trust him. In the end, the house remained exactly where it belonged. But more importantly, so did my dignity.